Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's podcast is going to be a little different. It isn't going to feature a comic creator or a comics retailer or anyone in comics at all. This person doesn't even read comics, which is really the point. We're going to explore comics from the perspective of a person who loves comic movies and anime, but has never been interested in reading comics. Before talking about 3 comics she read for the episode to get insight into how she feels about the medium after reading some. All that, and she's my wife. It's Amber Harper. Amber, are you ready to talk about the world of comics?
Yeah, I am.
So I have to set the stage for our listeners. We are recording this in my office at a table facing each other. Is this weird?
It's really weird. I feel like we're in one of those castles with the long table where each person's on the end.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not only are we on the same table, but I'm actually, I've set it up horizontally that way that we're facing each other exactly like that from a distance. It seems like we should be playing Battleship, as I joked about before. Okay, so to start with, I actually want to get your personal comic book history. And when you hear comic books, I'm sure you think about all the things in this room. But when I'm talking about comics, I mean newspaper comic strips, Archie, anything like that. Do you have any background with comics?
Not really. I, grew up, having the paper delivered to the house. So we would, look at some of the funny pages in the newspaper, but it wasn't something I consistently looked at. And I think my dad had he was into kind of the Far Side stuff. So I remember, seeing some of those, and we get the New Yorker. So there'd be little comic bits in there too, and that's kind of the extent of my comic background.
Did you have a certain perception of comics? Was there a single type of thing you would imagine when you heard the word comic books?
I mean, no, really, because I don't really remember people that I was around reading comics, or they didn't actually promote it, or say that they did. So I don't really have any sort of even idea about it. It was just sort of comics are a thing out there, but it was so far from my orbit, it didn't really impinge at all.
What about as an adult before we met? Did you primarily think superheroes, or was there any vision as to what comics were whatsoever?
I guess comics, in that sense, as I got older, kind of meant more superhero stuff, because that's what I would see, in the movies that were kind of coming out at the time, early on, and it was sort of oh, this is a comic movie. And so that was more the idea that I had about comics, is that it was more kind of superhero.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like that perception has changed since we met?
Oh, yeah.
In what way did it happen?
So it's changed in that, seeing that, I mean, obviously there's more than just superheroes, and stories are stories, and comics are just telling all different types of stories. And so, after meeting you and being able to see how many different types of, comics are out there, I guess that's when I started to understand that comics is really just more a medium of storytelling that I just wasn't familiar with. So it didn't mean comics equals superheroes. It's comics equal, a story told through art, basically. And so that changed my perception on that.
I do think it's funny, too, because after we met, did you know that Claire read comics before you met me?
I did.
Okay. So Amber has a friend / coworker, Claire, who was really into is really into Love and Rockets and alternative comics like R. Crumb and things like that. And it was really fascinating because I meet Amber and then I meet her friend, who basically has the diametrically opposite experience from me, a person who has never read Love and Rockets and hasn't read any of those things. And that is her entire comic worldview, which is kind of funny because it's there's two people who love the same medium and love completely different things, in the same way that, people like different movies and shows and everything like that.
Yeah. And she was, I think at the time, getting into more, there were some comics that were telling kind of historical type stuff, big events that had been happening, kind of pop culture type stuff that she was really into. And I remember you talking to her, and it was even wow, that's really niche.
Mm-hmm. I was totally blown away. She was showing me her original issues, Love and Rockets, and I was oh my God, these are legit. I'm I feel so basic in comparison. I have to ask, how do you feel the cats? We have 2 cats for listeners that don't know. How do you feel the cats currently feel about comics and the idea of podcasts as they dig at the door to try to get in?
I think that they're concerned that they feel left alone and that we're having fun without them.
That is almost certain. They will probably have dug a tunnel into this room by the end of it. But I did want to bring up something you told me the first time we went into a comic shop together, which was Bosco's Comics here in Anchorage, Alaska. We've done that many times in many comic shops since, but one thing you told me always really stuck with me. You probably know exactly what it was. You asked me, how do you know where to start? And I remember realizing that I'd pretty much never asked myself that question before because I'd been reading comics my entire life, and I was just like, I start with the one that seems interesting. But I also realized that is a completely reasonable response. Do you feel like that's a factor in how you view comics, that they're just sort of impenetrable?
Yeah, like I feel like an outsider is what it is. And in particular, you know, that first time it felt very weird. You know, like I felt like I didn't belong there. And I was thinking about that because Bosco's had since, when we first went into there, it was their older shop, and they've since moved and sort of updated things, and it feels a lot more welcoming than it did before. And that's just from like a store standpoint, you know, not even with me knowing more. It feels more welcoming now. It feels more delineated. Whereas before it was just like, you know, kind of like walking into like a thrift shop or something. Like it was just like all this stuff everywhere. And you're like, where do I start? What do I, you know, there's little signs like go over here, go over there. I'm like, I don't know what publishers mean. Like, what is it? I don't know publishers. Like, you know, if I wanted to even, you know, at the time, it's like I probably knew Batman, you know, maybe the best. And so it's like, okay, well, if I want to look at something Batman, like, where do I even go? And there's like weird cutouts and toys, and now there's sports stuff back there. As you know, and it just felt kind of like maybe I don't belong here. You know, and I should, as opposed to like, oh, I'm going to just wander the aisles. I mean, it felt very much kind of like, you know, in the old Westerns where the out-of-towner comes in and the music scratches and everyone turns to look. You know, it felt kind of like that, even though I don't think that's what was actually happening, but from my perspective, it felt like that.
Yeah, I mean, that previous location was really dark, and it was like kind of I don't want to say walking into a dungeon because that sounds really dramatic, but it kind of felt like the idea of a comic shop from somebody who was an outsider to the new location, which is a lot brighter. It's got taller ceilings, all stuff like that. That's one of the funny things about the difference between me and you is like when we go into a comic shop, I'm like, where are the Stiltman comics? And you're like, oh, this is an interesting layout. How does this work? Like, this is a interesting building. And it's funny having those different perspectives, but you know, that was one nice thing about our trip to France was going there and seeing how much that stuff made sense to you because they had things like their, you know, graphic novels laid out by genre, where it's like if you want a science fiction comic, this is where you go. Or if you want a Western, this is where you go. As opposed to a lot of the comic shops we've been to where it's like, here are Dark Horse comics. And you're like, I don't understand what Dark Horse is.
Yeah, and it's like, well, that's a publisher. I'm like, that's cool. I don't know what that's supposed to mean to me, you know, and that's, you know, just, you know, being raised around books and stuff. I mean, my family, I mean, we kind of had our own little library in the house and stuff. I mean, we very, very fond of books. And so I'm used to navigating bookstores, no problem, you know, like used books, new books, you know, whatever. But the comic shop was just a whole different thing. Like I didn't understand.
I had a patron that asked a question, Scott Hazelwood, who asked, you know, what sort of things are the most confounding or frustrating about comics if you're newer to them? Is there something that really stood out? Was it things like that where you're like, I just don't know where to start?
Yeah, I mean, it was really like, I don't know where to start because, I mean, even like we've talked about, like if I, just for example, you know, I'm like, oh, I've seen some Batman movies. You know, I like grew up like watching all these different variations of Batman in the 60s TV show and, you know, all this different stuff. So like, yeah, I'm going to start reading some Batman stuff. And it's like, well, actually, there's different runs and where do you want to start? Maybe the story you're familiar with is actually this issue, I don't know, 300 or, you know, something. I'm like, wait, what? You know, like, whereas normally I'm used to like, oh, I'm interested in this series. Like you start at book 1 and then you just continue through the series. But this was not like that. And then it was like, well, there's different eras. And then there's when he came back. And I was just like, what in the world? You know, so it's like, that's just really, I mean, I still don't understand it, you know? Well, yeah. I mean, I'd still need somebody to help me navigate if I said, well, hey, I really enjoy this movie. Where can I learn more about this storyline? You know, like I at least know now that there's different storylines and stuff. But it's still really hard to just jump in when someone's like, well, where do you want to start? I'm like, I guess at number 1. It's like, well, actually, you don't because that's so long ago.
Also, there's like 500 number 1s at
yeah,
this point.
Well, exactly. So then I'm like, I don't know. Well, what artist do you like? What writer do you like? I'm like, I don't know any of this.
I like Batman.
I like Batman. And now I'm questioning that because I don't know who is he, you know?
Yeah. It makes me, or it reminds me, another thing from our France trip was when we were in a shop, and I think it was Lyon, you found this like little fold-out thing that was literally a guide to Batman on like where to start, and it was from Urban Comics. And I remember you being like, this makes sense.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think is interesting is I have gotten you to read comics before. I don't try to get you to read comics almost ever. Actually, it was really just this one time. And it was because you had become interested in Jane Foster Thor as a character. You like even cosplayed as a flapper version at Denver Comic Con when you went with your friend. Mm-hmm. And I bought you a couple trades of the Jason Aaron and Russell Dauterman Thor run that featured the character. And you were turned off by it pretty quickly. I have to ask, what turned you off on it? Because it was a very specific thing that, again, I'm just like, oh, this is a thing that Marvel does. But when you said that this is a thing, I was like, oh my God, this is insane that they do that.
Yeah, so I was reading the story, and it was a great story, and I got to the end, and there was just some random pages, and it was like very different art, and like I didn't know what was happening. I was like, is this the same story? Is this what is this? And it filled me with such confusion after finishing the actual comic part of it. And I didn't know what to do. And David's like, well, this is what Marvel does. They like put some stuff in there, and this is from this other issue, or this is some, I was like, I don't know what that means. Like if I didn't have him to kind of help me navigate through that, I'd still be in even more confusion of just like, I guess there's just some like fan art in the back or something. I really had no idea because it was just so different from the art I was looking at that, to me, like that was the best way to describe it, was just like, I don't know what this is.
Yeah. So basically the gist is I think it was the second trade you had read. The first one was just all the way through Russell Dauterman, Jason Aaron. And then the second one had at the back of it a Thor annual that had different stories from 3 different writers and 3 different artists, and it was completely different. And then all of a sudden there was like reprints from like the 1960s with like Jack Kirby art, and you were like, what in the world happened to this? Why is it written completely different? Why is the art completely different? This is like, actually, I don't even think it was Jack Kirby. I think it was like the what if Jane Foster became Thor story. And
didn't I just read that?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
What
isn't
is
this literally the story I'm reading?
Well, and that was what was kind of confusing about it, is that there at no point in time did it say like, this is what you're looking at, and if it said that, like, oh, here's an excerpt from something else, or here's something, that had happened previously, or, then I would at least understand what was going on. But it was just like, you flip a page and then all of a sudden you're seeing different stuff and then seeing more different stuff. And that was, from somebody who isn't familiar, with all of this, like that was super confusing.
Yeah. Well, if you finish a story and then all of a sudden a different story that has nothing to do with it starts, you're going to be turned off to the point where you don't want to watch. It's like, if you're watching an episode of like a Netflix series and instead of going to the next episode, it goes to the next episode of a completely different show that stars the same person. You're like, what? Like,
yeah. I'm like, is this a dreamscape thing, or like what's happening now? Like,
I thought I was watching The Untamed, and all of a sudden I'm watching, I don't know, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. It's like a completely different thing. I remember that in like those two experiences, the comic shop one and the one with the Thor book, just completely made me realize how insane some of the things really are that I've accepted for my entire life, because I'm like, sure, Marvel puts in extra comics at the end of their thing, or their trade paperbacks, so they can charge a little bit more. It's just kind of what they do. And I'm like, why is that a thing? That makes it much harder.
Yeah, it's like when you grow up in it, I think you just know, and it's just the way things are, and you don't really question it because you understand it, and it just, you just accept it and move on. And it's from somebody else who isn't coming in like early on, like as a kid like that, then it's just, well, what is this? I need a little bit of explanation.
Yeah. I do want to say, though, Russell Dauterman did like your cosplay, though. I actually sent it to him, and he was very fond of it. But
it was really fun.
You do love a lot of comic adaptations. In particular, there were the like first 3 phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The 4th phase you're a little iffy on. You've liked parts of it, like Shang-Chi, and you liked Eternals and some other stuff like that. And you also really like a whole lot of anime, namely Jujutsu Kaisen, My Hero Academia, Bleach, and Cowboy Bebop. So you do like comic-related things, like things you could be reading versions of it, if you so desired. What is it you appreciate about those? Is there like a particular affinity you have for those types of stories?
Well, I guess, besides the storylines, like the storylines are really great because, they kind of naturally follow a sort of fantasy and sci-fi type of slant to it, especially with like the superhero type stuff. Like I understand there's different, types of more like day-to-day real life type of stories, but I feel like even in reality TV, I don't watch that kind of stuff. You know?
Right.
I just don't find that as interesting. And so it's just the way that the stories get told, the world building that they make, the characters like are people you really, I feel like you're invested in and you care about them. And like that to me is, you know, what draws me to them. And kind of in that later Marvel time, which I guess is what we're in now, like I just feel like they're losing track of kind of the caring for the characters. You know, it's just like they're trying to push a storyline that kind of doesn't make sense, and they're just like, accept it. You know, I'm like, well, I can't. I need to understand in order to like accept it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things we've kind of always talked about is the things that kind of turn you off of it is like the universal stuff that makes it feel like homework versus the things that you really like, which are characters and like the adventures that they go on and like those stories making sense in isolation, but also fitting in this larger thing. If it becomes about the larger thing, then it's just out of control.
Yeah, and you know, it's like when they had the whole Thanos, you know, arc and stuff in Marvel, like that made sense. Like you had these kind of individuals that you built on and they became the Avengers, and then they brought in other people, and you know, then it became this bigger thing. And like that, like I'm totally fine. I was just, you know, eating the breadcrumbs all the way through all that. But it's like when you're just sort of forced to like believe that there's been this mastermind behind everything, and I'm like, really? I've never heard of anything about that, or nothing ever alluded to that. And we've talked about before, like with even like the James Bond, like the Spectre,
oh, yeah.
You know, all of a sudden it's like, I'm behind it all. And you're like, wait, what? That's kind of demeaning to everybody else, like all the other villains, you know?
Right.
And nobody was, you know, talking about them or saying like, oh, there was this bigger mastermind that was helping them pull strings. You know, it's just like came completely out of left field. And like, that's the type of stuff that takes me out of the story, where it's just like this character that just comes out of the blue and it's like, I'm the evil one, you know, and I have a hard time with that, with any kind of story.
Well, and I think though, in terms of the positive, like one of the things that seems like it works really well for you is, let's say you're watching Jujutsu Kaisen. So you want to watch Jujutsu Kaisen. What do you start with? Episode 1. Mm-hmm. And then you just go from there. And it's just, that's the story. And it seems like that's appealing to you because then you're just like in this world and it's just one world, and there's never like Jujutsu Kaisen remixed volume 1 or something like that, or new Jujutsu Kaisen. It's just Jujutsu Kaisen all the way through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you do like the movies and the shows and all this stuff like that, because like all these things come from the comics to some degree. What's the big difference between the movie and show versions for you versus the comics? Or like to say that another way, what makes you interested in those but not the comics?
I think it's just the kind of the theater of it. You know what I mean? It's actually playing out as opposed to reading it. You know, and that's something that it really comes alive a little bit more and comes off the page. And I mean, even like with books, like that's a thing sometimes of like seeing it, you know, actually being played out makes me care for the characters more. Like they come more alive because, you know, they are actually alive and stuff. And so I think that that's what's appealing to me as far as the shows and the movies versus the comics, because it's already kind of off the page, I guess. And, you know, I guess it's just not having read the comic medium. Like it's a little, I don't know how to say it. It's like when you're reading a book, like you imagine the characters, you know, and then you see a show or a movie and they've kind of like come to life and you're like, oh, that is my, you know, so-and-so character, or I saw this character different or something like that. But I feel like with the comics, it kind of it shows you what they are already. And so there's a little bit of that imagination, I guess, that I feel like is lost as far as just, you know, reading a book. And so it's not good or bad. It's just different. And so to me, it's like, well, if I'm going to do that, I might as well just watch the movie or the show.
Right.
And I've already seen it. Now I see, you know, what it is, and it's come alive for me in that way. And that's just kind of what I've been used to.
I also think to some degree, it's like, you know, you watch a Batman movie and it's like you have your version of Batman. Like your friend Jen loves Michael Keaton. Yeah. And like I'm like a Christian Bale guy or Christopher Nolan. Like I love those movies. But when it comes deep down to those stories, they can pull from like the history of the comics, and they can tell basically an interpretation of like all of the best stories ever, combine them together and make like this giant super movie built from the comics themselves. So it's kind of cherry picking the comics to make the best version of a Batman story or a I don't know, I was going to say the X-Men story, but that can be an occasionally really bad example. Or like, Avengers. It's like, the funny thing is I don't know if I ever told you this, the Avengers for a very long time were not really that big of a deal in comics. I mean, they were, but they were never sold like X-Men or Spider-Man or something like that. They were kind of like, the ones that Marvel didn't sell, which is the reason why they ended up making movies out of those characters to start with. And so it's kind of funny that it ended up becoming like the biggest franchise in like basically movie history. Well, one of the biggest franchises. I don't know. I mean, it's like there's enough of it that you can cherry pick from their cherry picking and find the ones that speak the most to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, if you're reading comics or books or something, you're stuck with that storyline or that version of it. And so, maybe there's some highlights, maybe there's not, in different runs. So, I can see where the movies are really kind of like the all-star, the all-star team or something of like, all the best parts, put into one. But, again, that also makes it confusing as far as like getting into the comics, like from the sort of entertainment side of it, I guess, is that because it has cherry picked through different stories, what I would be used to if I tried to pick up comics, it wouldn't be, oh, it's this comic over here.
Right.
Because it is like, well, it's made up of these 5 different runs and they got put together and then they threw this other thing into and a dash of this and something and they stirred it up and this is what the movie or the show came up with. And so that's what makes it really hard to, kind of get into the comics because it's almost like the cinematic universe has already created their own new story,
right?
So it's like, okay, well, this is a story I know. This is a story I'm going to stick with then.
Well, and I think that, this is one of the reasons why with like the superhero stuff, it hasn't translated or doesn't always translate to significantly more sales for the comics. And part of the reason for that is because when I showed you, I once did an article for Sketched for listeners that don't know, that was interviewing Amber about like looking through the all new, all different magazine that Marvel did for like the upcoming launch. And I was getting her opinions on stuff. And when you looked at the Avengers book, you're like, who are these people? They didn't look like the Avengers to you, as opposed to like anime. So like one of the reasons why manga has become so popular is because people finish the Spy Family that's on TV, on Crunchyroll or whatever, and they want to know more so they can go and buy the manga and they can get the next stories. And then they can go back and read anime and it becomes this feedback loop. Or like with The Walking Dead or Scott Pilgrim or Invincible, it's like, where do you start with those? You start with volume 1. You just go to like the first available one, as opposed with superhero ones where it's like, okay, so I read, I watched Ant-Man. What Ant-Man comic should I read? To be honest, I've been reading comics my entire life. I have no idea. It's Ant-Man. I don't know where to send you.
Yeah, I'm like, that's not helpful.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like with a lot of this stuff, with the superhero stuff in particular, it's really difficult to funnel people from one store or from, one medium to another because it doesn't translate as easy.
Yeah, and I think the problem is that there's so many storylines, whether you're talking about the comics or movies and shows or, the combination, there's now so many different storylines that it's like, what do you follow? And
there's enough superhero and, comic stuff like, Scott Pilgrim or Invincible or, anime that you don't really need the other, if you don't feel like reading the comics, you can just read that or watch those things and you will basically never run out of things to watch.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just hours and hours and hours and hours of it. So I totally get it. But I did have a question that was related to it, and I think it's the most important question I'm going to ask in this podcast. We both really like the movie Captain America, the Winter Soldier, and there's a line in that movie that I always think of because of you. So my question is, what is your favorite line from Captain America, the Winter Soldier?
Oh, this seems like you're setting me up here. Like,
it's an interview. That's what an interview literally is.
It's like, how well do you know me?
Well, I mean, there's 2 lines, but I suspect you know which one I'm talking about.
Is it the one where they're in the bunker?
Yes.
And the guy just says, like, first correction, like, I am Swiss.
Well, you didn't say it like you normally do.
Well, because it's a really bad accent, and I don't want to be judged by everybody with my bad accent.
Well, I mean, they're going to judge us anyways. You might as well do the bad accent.
I already said it.
Oh, my God. Yeah. It's more like...
I think you set me up to do that in particular, which
I did. First correction, I am Swiss. Something like that. Anyway, she always says that right before he says it, and it's amazing. But I do want to say, this is an important note. It seems like I'm setting you up, but really I am setting you up for something else. if a person can quote Arnim Zola, one of the dumbest characters in comic book history, a dude whose like body has a, I don't know, hologram 3D, not even 3D, it's just like a screen that shows his face in the center of his body. Marvel should be better at making you interested in reading comics. Like, it's a massive fail by them that they turn you off by the one time you actually read their comics, because clearly you're interested in their stories and their characters. You can quote Arnim Zola.
Yeah. Well, the thing too that's interesting is that, he obviously looks very different in the movie than in the comics, but like that doesn't bother me so much. I really enjoy kind of those bigger universe things. Like I would be fine, being like, okay, this is a different story. I get it. I'm not so beholden to like one sort of universe, I understand how that works, but it's just like, it's that thing again of like, well, where do you start? And like, this is such a different character than I'm used to, I think, because like, within these bigger universes, like, I think of like the Star Wars type universe, it's like, there are these sort of fixed points of personalities and stuff, I guess, where it's like, what's going to happen, or something's happening across the universe, even though this is a different story that's being told in a pocket kind of area that's not super important or whatever, to like the Skywalker saga type of thing. But, it's just like, it's different though when you start getting into like, well, it's like there's a multiverse and like everything's different and, this person's not what you think they are. And it's like, okay, I can get behind some of that, but it's just so confusing, I think, like as somebody new trying to come into that of like, well, where would I even start with this stuff? And like, I'm somebody who I am okay with multiverses and, it's like that sci-fi part, fantasy sci-fi part. Like, I'm okay with like storylines like that. Like, I don't need to have the exact storyline that's in the movies in a comic so I can get interested, but it's just the comic itself is just a little, the way it's set up is a little confusing.
Yeah, you need a starting point. You need to know where to go next.
Yeah, or even to say like, okay, well, this is Captain America, but in this different year or this different Earth or whatever. If there was like a little bit of a preface where I'm like, okay, well, I get it. So I'm same sort of person, a little bit different, this is what's happening. Okay, go, scene and here we go. But not having that to kind of start from and then walking into a shop and just being like, having someone point at something and say, well, you might like this. And then I have no references to what world are they in, because that might tie in with other comics too, where it's, we've talked about there's different Earths or whatever. And I'm just like, I don't know this, is there kind of like a starter's guide of like, okay, if you're reading this, like maybe this is some stuff you should know. And that was something that I appreciated when we were in France and, was it Francois?
Francois, yeah.
And when we were talking with him and it was just like, yes, finally someone understands, like, this is super confusing, right? So yeah, having a bit of a preface and then like, having this book that ties everything together. And it's like, okay, now we're going to put in this other story, which is going to seem random, but it's important for you to know because there's things that happen, which then lead you into the next series. And I was like, this is kind of what I'm looking for, because that was a way that I could understand, like I could get stuff for my nephew to like get him interested in things, but it's just like not having that here is just kind of weird. And so I think it's a bit off-putting of like, it almost seems like it's hard. It's almost like the industry is making it hard for new people to get into it. Whereas like, he's like, hey, well, I want to get people interested. So I have to explain to them kind of what's going on. And I feel like that's okay, because it's like, I am starting from zero. And so it's kind of like, oh, well, that's your bad for not being interested in this earlier. And, catching the first wave of this stuff. And it's just like, but how does it continue on if you don't bring people in and get them interested in a place where they can start and feel like, oh, I'm being helped out?
I do think that is a superhero specific problem. Like there are other comics, like most of my room that we're recording in isn't superhero comics. And like that stuff is easier to get into. The complication with that is like, you don't know it exists. And like nobody's like advertising, I don't know, Bad Machinery or Ducks to you or something like that, which are comics you don't even know what are. So it's, it's still like, how do you know where to start except for with no baseline of awareness, which is part of the reason why things like The Walking Dead and Invincible became as popular as they are with non-comic readers. They're things that you know about because you've seen shows about them and everything. But unfortunately for you, or fortunately for you, and fortunately for me and listeners, I did give you some books to read. I gave Amber a big pile of 3 different comics, or 3 different types of comics: Marvel comics, DC comics, and everything else to pick from. She picked 3 comics. We're going to discuss those from her perspective, what she liked about them, what she didn't like about them, everything else after the break. And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Looking for the right place to read digital comics? You can find it at Omnibus. Omnibus is a modern digital comic book store and reader app carrying your favorite single issues, volumes, and omnibuses, all day and date. It's just like a comic shop where you pay per book, but digital. Omnibus has even upped its game lately, as they've added a web reader in store on top of its iPad version, with iPhone and Android coming soon. Looking for an ideal digital comic store, but with an excellent shopping and reading experience? One that uses novel discovery features to help fans find their next new favorite book? And one that features many of the best comics and publishers in comics today, including publishers like Image, Boom, Dark Horse, and more? You can find all that on Omnibus. Visit the web store or download the app today at omnibus.app. And now, back to the show. All right, now it's time to dig into the comics themselves. We're going to discuss 3 comics Amber read, chatting about a variety of things that stood out or didn't work in her mind as someone that has very little experience with the medium. And here's an important note. We have not talked about these comics at all in advance. Amber, is that true?
That's very true.
Not about their quality, not about characters, not about anything. I just know she read them. We're going to talk about them in the order that you read them in. So up first, we have the first digest-size collection of the first volume of Runaways by Brian K. Vaughan, Adrian Alfona, and more. Amber, let's start with the basic question. What did you think of this one? Did you like it?
Yeah, I did like it. And it was nice to have it be kind of wrapped up as one story, or like a season of a show or something like that.
So like having a collection makes more sense to you than like a single issue. Reading it like that just kind of made sense in your mind. Yeah.
And I think that also goes back to me reading books. Like, it would be a single issue would be almost like a chapter coming out at a time. And like, that's kind of maddening to me, because I have binge mentality. So I want to like finish it. I want to, read as far as I can before I fall asleep type of thing. And even in shows, I like to wait till there's a good chunk of episodes out that I can watch all at once.
Before we get into it, though, I did want to say you didn't know anything about this comic before going in. I don't know if you read the back of it or anything like that, but did the twist of the parents being evil surprise you?
No, because I kind of just generally kind of knew about it. I think I did read the back of it, and I think it does refer to something about like what happens if your parents turn out to be evil or something. So I just knew the basic premise of these kids find out their parents are superheroes, actually supervillains, and then what do they do from there? So I went into the book with that basic knowledge.
I'm glad you got to read a Brian K. Vaughan comic, because one of the things that he's really good at is like final pages. And I was just flipping through it. I haven't read that in a long time. And that one is so good at the final pages, because the first one ends with the part where they find out that their parents like sacrifice someone basically. And then the next one has the reveal of Old Lace, the Velociraptor, and everything like that. And it's so good. Like, he's so good at the rhythms of like, it's almost kind of like TV show rhythms where it's like you always want to end with a cliffhanger and you always want to get somebody like really hooked on that. And like that one does a really good job of that.
Yeah, it does. And it was, I think toward the end there, maybe not in the last scene, but you see maybe the last scene with the parents, they find a note that's, one of the kids supposedly dropped or left that said that, they're helping out or something. So you're kind of like, oh, well, who's that? And then it ends there basically,
Yeah.
And so it gives that promise of like more to come, sort of like a cliffhanger. I would say almost like a season cliffhanger in a TV show, so you have that to digest for another year or so until the next season comes out.
So just to dig into like the meat of it, what worked for you? What made this one something you liked?
Well, I think just following the kids around, I thought was really fun, and sort of learning things as they learn them. And so it's pretty shocking, if you imagine a bunch of kids and they just think their parents are sort of normal and, have like just normal problems and stuff. And then you realize like, oh, wow, they're actually supervillains, like that's like a whole nother level of my parents are evil kind of thing. And it just reminds me of, kind of growing up in the 80s and stuff. And there's a lot of those movies of like these adventures with kids and kind of what they find out. And they sort of start realizing the world's maybe not what they thought it was, or it's bigger than they thought it was. And I thought that was a really great story to like come in on.
I also think that one of the things that's really fun about this idea, and by fun, I mean, it's just like, okay, fun is probably the wrong word. It is the opposite of fun, but the fact that these kids only get together when their parents get together, and then like the realization there's just like, every time we've gotten together, they've probably sacrificed someone. So it's like every time I see these friends that are kind of like these people that I hang out with on occasion that I'm forced to because our parents are friends, it's actually because of that. And you're like, oh my God, our parents aren't just super villains. They're like super, super, super villains.
Yeah. It's like we're having a meeting where we sacrifice somebody every year potentially or whatever. So it's quite shocking.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I picked this was because, or I picked this as an option for you, is because Marvel has a tendency of, they're not the best at having kind of standalone stories that are really easy to get into necessarily. This one has no background history into it. It doesn't have like, a bunch of other Marvel characters showing up. And I know you also didn't watch the Runaways show. One thing I'm curious about is, this is a Marvel comic, and Marvel is the universe I'd say you're most familiar with because of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Did Runaways feel like a Marvel story to you?
I mean, it did, and the reason why it did is that it seemed to get into the characters, and that's what I like the Marvel movies is that, or I guess just stories, is that they really make you feel about the characters and they're relatable, and it was kind of funny that the lead-in to kind of set the stage for the world was an RPG game that they're playing. Some sort of Avengers, like one of the kids is playing like a, one of this sort of Avenger game. So like at least that put me into the state of mind of like, okay, so this is where it's happening. Like there is a Captain America, there is, I think there's a Hulk or something. There's some of these basic characters that I'm familiar with at least, where I'm like, okay, so it's in this world, and this is just a pocket within that, bigger world that's going on. So that was a nice way to just quickly drop me in on like, this is where you're at, this is kind of what's happening, and now let's take you to these kids in, was it like LA area or something like that, and let's see what these kids are doing, which I really like when they take these big universes and then make a small story within it, because I mean that's kind of like the everyday person, like not everybody is a superhero in these worlds, or part of some larger saga. Some people are just kids trying to like go to school and be normal, and it's just kind of fun to have that lined up in a way that it didn't have to say a whole lot in order to do that. And so you have that, and then just you start really feeling for these kids because they have these little snapshots of them getting ready for the dinner party and what they're going through as far as their family situations, and they're all coming from different family type situations. And so it seems like somebody could relate to one of those families for sure.
Yeah. So Marvel's whole thing is they want, like DC's thing is like, these are like gods and titans and stuff like that, or sometimes literally titans. But with Marvel, one of the things that's really interesting about them is their whole thing is they want people to be able to like relate to their characters and to see their worlds and stuff like that. And I think it's really smart what they did in this book, in the sense that they build that connection right in the beginning, like you said, but then they also, instead of being in New York, it's in Los Angeles. Instead of being familiar characters, it's characters that are already familiar with other ones and know that world and everything like that. And so it's like they're building something new from familiar things and making it totally fresh in the process, which I think is really cool.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of like, the Ant-Man movie, the first one, where they're like, okay, first we should probably call the Avengers, and they're like, no, we can't, and it's just that thing, because I think in this story too, they say something about like, oh, we should call the Avengers, and one of the kids is like, it's a fake line, like I've called it before, it just like goes to recording, or like nobody picks it up unless it's like an interplanetary problem or something like that, and so that makes it feel like, okay, well, here are these just normal people that need help, but like they're kind of small beans in this superhero world. So what do? They create their own little group.
Yeah, do you call Captain America and say, I think my parents are bad?
Yeah, it's like when they called the cops just at the police department. They're like, okay, I've heard this one before. Your parents are bad. They're evil. They're doing stuff. Okay. And it's, how do you tell somebody, no, I'm being really serious about this. Like, I think they're killing people. And they're like, oh, okay, so this is where we're just going to hang up. It sounds like a prank call.
So we talked about the things you did like. Was there anything that didn't work for you?
I don't think there was anything that didn't work for me, actually. Like, I thought that, just the book itself was a nice size to sit down and read and flip through and not have to, kind of balance it or something. Like, some books can be kind of arduous to just sit and read because they're either too thick or too big or, something like that. So it was great. And I think that the story itself was well told. And, one of the things that I think I have a little hang up on is like, well, how do I know how to read comics? Because it's not just, there is like a read left to right type of thing, but it's not like a book where it's just like, here's a line, here's a line, here's a line. Like, you're going from panel to panel. And sometimes the story is told between two panels, like over two panels, like, told in a different way. Like, this is a narration versus this is an actual thing being said versus this is something someone's thinking, and so like, how do you navigate that? But, seeing the different sort of talk bubbles and like how they were set up, and I didn't have to ask you like, what's going on here? Like, I could pick it up enough through the story of like, oh, this is an internal monologue of this person and this is how it's shown. So if I see this again, that's the inner monologue of somebody else. So it was not as, I guess, difficult as I thought it would be initially to just navigate through the narration of it.
That actually, I think, was pretty much by design because, well, first off, Brian K. Vaughan is a really good writer and Adrian Alphona, the artist, is a really good storyteller, but also this was part of like a Marvel line back in like the early 2000s where they were trying to make something that kind of fit a younger audience to some degree. And that's why they printed it in the kind of digest size, like the kind of manga size format, which is really nice. Unfortunately, I don't think comic shops really liked it at the time because they're like, this is so different. This is so weird. I don't know.
I love it. It's a great size.
It is a great size. It's so easy to hold. The only problem I have looking at it is it's kind of prints dark. It's a little darker than like the other books that you looked at.
Yeah. Well, part of that is the paper quality itself. It's not newspaper, but it's a rougher paper. And so it takes the ink differently. It just soaks it in.
And it's also like 21 years old versus the other two, which are just like basically brand new.
It was interesting because like reading through it, there was this, I don't know, subconscious cue of like what was going on, where the book does read pretty dark, but it's because the background of the panels is really dark. And as you read through, it's like you almost see the time of day change.
Oh, yeah.
And so like that was really kind of fun to see. Just this subtle thing. It does tell you like it's this time of day over here and that type of stuff. But it just kind of helps with this sort of background narration, that it did seem a little bit darker. And, I think that was part of the reason, too, because a lot of this is happening at night, where they're like after the dinner party, they're trying to figure things out. And so it's happening in this time frame that's like middle of the night. So that's why it also just feels a little bit darker that way.
Yeah. Well, I do want to give a shout out. The colorist is Brian Reber. Brian Reber was actually one of the people in that Twitter basketball DM that I used to be a part of. And the funny thing is like, it's not funny. It's just an interesting thing about comics. Like, people kind of forget that it takes like an entire team to do this. So it was like, I mentioned Brian K. Vaughan and Adrian Alphona, but there's also inks by David Newbold and Craig Young. And then there's colors by Brian Reber. And the thing about it is like colors are storytelling too. Like you're saying, it's just what Brian was doing, the choices he was making was materially impacting your understanding of the story. And I think a lot of people don't really think about that because it's just like something you interpret subconsciously without really actively thinking about it. It's not like words, or it's not like a character acting on the page, but the colors really do affect how you engage with the story.
Yeah, for sure. And just to mention, like, that was one thing on this book when I was, opening it, going through the pages, just making sure I'm taking it all in, and I was like, damn, there is a lot of people, on this credits page, where it kind of just reminded me of like the end of a movie where, it's just names. Because, there's just a lot of effort that goes into making one of these. And it was, just pretty interesting, like how specific these jobs can be for different people, because to me, it's just like art. art's a thing, but art can, that's divided up into obviously a number of different things or tasks that people do. And so it was a long list. It was a good team, a good amount of people on the team. As
we'll get into it, the other books, that's the interesting thing is there's like so many different ways to do it. That one is just, that's an entire team, but one of the other books is one person. Another one is two people who work together, one who is a co-writer and like an artist and a colorist and an inker. And I don't know, I want to say that she lettered it, but I could be mistaken. But anyways, favorite part.
Yeah, so favorite part, I think, would be when the kids are, I can't remember her name, but they're in this girl's house, and it's, there's a secret passageway, and then there's like a secret room, and then there's this keypad, and they're trying to figure out, like, what...
I want to say it's Nico.
I don't think it's Nico. It's the one where they discover the dinosaur behind the locked door.
Oh, that's Gert.
Okay. And
arsenic.
Yes, it was really funny because it just like all of my senses of like, the all the Q people in the world, like from, James Bond type stuff, it just all that stuff started kind of going off a little bit too, of like, oh, I know this. It's like what is it? The National Treasure, where they're trying to figure out the keypads and stuff. I'm like, I know this, and it was just really great. And then there's this dinosaur behind there, and everyone's like, oh my God. And it comes out, and is actually just fine because, she calms it down and stuff. But I think at that point, it really became like real for the kids.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just, oh, we can see this, like we have secret tunnels in our house. Like, okay, so does everybody apparently, but this was something that really took it to the next level of like, okay, this is becoming real. Like there's this off-world designer pet that was made, to protect her, and they discovered it. And it was sort of like I think kind of one of the first evidence of like, this isn't normal, you know? And I think they discovered there was a book, and it was like, oh, this ring that you should find. And, it really started to become like real, I think, at that point. And that was really fun as a turning point in the story.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is one of the interesting things is because each of the parents have like these different approaches to crime. It's like there's time travelers and there's magic people and there's all this. You kind of get different flavors throughout the whole thing. I think that's really fun. But was there a favorite character from the book?
I think as far as characters, like I really liked Nico, and I think it's probably because, like she just taps into my teenage goth. Like, I'm like, oh, I know this person. This person's cool.
Yeah. I have to admit, when you started reading it, I was like, she's totally like Nico. I mean, like the fact that when we were flying, the only thing we did talk about was like how dated some of the references were just because it came out so long ago. The fact that she specifically references her AIM name is Sister Grimm, so she's going to call herself that. AOL Instant Messenger. People reading it today would probably be like, AIM? Like the people from, like the beekeepers from Marvel? What is this? I don't even understand what that is. Yeah, Nico is totally your type of person. I do think the dated thing is kind of funny. It's not like, my friend Brandon, as you know, Brandon Burpee for listeners, he has this thing where he hates specific references to times because he's just like, it's going to date it immediately. But I actually think that it works for this because you read it and it like instantly puts you in that place and like you really understand it because of that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, I mean, because I guess I've lived through that, so like I can relate to that. But there's also like these older references that they're making too, and I appreciate that in the fact of like, again, it puts me in like squarely into a world, and it's like it's a world it has these things like even the arsenic and lace. I mean, I had a good laugh from that because I'm like, that's a deep cut old movie, that like I grew up on, but like even people my age or age, just have never heard of it even, or maybe heard some sort of reference, but don't know what it is. And so I just like all these little references on things I thought was just great. And it didn't feel dated in that sense. It just felt like this is their world,
I like how Gert was like, watch a movie before 1985.
Yeah. I mean, seriously, go watch movies older than 1985. There's a lot of good stuff out there, guys. So I'm going to combine two questions into one. Was there anything that was particularly cool in how the story was told or how it read? Or conversely, was there anything confusing about it? I don't think there was anything confusing. I mean, it was pretty well laid out, especially with, as you went through, it gave like a little kind of timestamp as, like they're getting ready for the party. There's a timestamp. You're at so-and-so's house. This is what's happening. Then, a little bit later, like 15 minutes later, you're at so-and-so's house, this is happening. And so, and then even just throughout the story, it'd be like, now it's 10 a.m. and this is what's going on. And I didn't really find that confusing at all. I thought it was actually really great.
So that seems like something you thought was cool, was the fact that they made it very easy to keep track of what is happening when and where it's happening and everything like that.
Yeah, because it just kind of keeps the story going, but it also makes sure that you're like along with it. And I don't know, I guess like stories that are kind of told like that, I feel like almost like the timestamps become important of like, you notice how quickly things are happening and now you're here and now this and now that. And there's like a certain rhythm that gets formed by doing that. And I thought that that was really neat to have that in the story, because then you start to feel these beats of like, it's going quicker, like what's happening. Oh my gosh, before things felt a little more spread out and now they're like happening even faster. So like, that's something that I guess you can convey like in a more written form than like in a visual meaning, like in a movie or something like that. Like you have music and stuff to kind of like help you with like, oh my gosh, this is important, like the rhythm of the song is starting to feel more intense, like this is intense, but without that music it could be whatever. So I feel like with those timestamps and things like that and the background color changes, it kind of gives you that feel of like, oh man, something's happening, what's going on, and it creates that rhythm of, get excited, things are getting crazy.
This is the only ongoing series that you read, so there's more of this you could read if you so desire. Did reading this make you want to read more of Runaways? I think that's kind of like the $1 million question.
Yeah, and I mean it did, because, in one respect, like I'm fine, like if I didn't read anymore, I'm like, well, that was pretty fun and like interesting, but it also felt like, because there were these little nuggets that were sort of left behind of like, okay, well now you have these kids that have created their own group and they want to do something different, but maybe one of them is a mole. Like, what do you do? What's going to happen with that? So there is like an interest to see what else happens.
Mm-hmm. So last Runaways related question for you. It's not really even Runaways related. You were once with me in a quiet corner of New York Comic Con's press room extended when I first interviewed writer Brian K. Vaughan for the podcast, who is my favorite comic writer, as you know. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being totally chill and 10 being, oh my God, it's Brian K. Vaughan. How did I handle that experience in your eyes?
I think you handled it pretty much like on a 12.
I don't know if you know this, but it was a 1 to 10 scale.
I heard you.
Okay, great. And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. New year, new Zoop. Zoop is proud to be the home of the first ever Jack Kirby crowdfunding campaign, Sky Masters of the Space Force, the complete Sunday strips. Also, by popular demand, they're reopening the Conan the Barbarian campaign featuring the legendary art of John Buscema, Gil Kane, Barry Windsor-Smith, and more. There's still time to support projects from Colin Bunn and the Maui Strong fundraiser, benefiting those affected by the Maui wildfires last year. Head over to zoop.gg to support the live campaigns and sign up for ones coming soon. It takes less than 30 seconds to create an account, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, every creator appreciates your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. All right, let's talk about the next comic you read, which was the only graphic novel that was not serialized in single issues first. It's Erica Henderson and Ryan North's Danger and Other Unknown Risks. What did you think of this one?
Oh, I love this one. I thought it was a great, like, complete story. That it felt satisfied. It didn't leave any real nuggets to be like, read, continue on to read more about what's going to happen down the line. It felt like it just felt like a complete story.
Was there anything specific that you really liked about it besides, it just being a complete story?
I mean, the storyline itself, the fact that like something had happened and I believe it's like all the magic kind of went out of the world and there was no electricity and things. And so it was like, it was almost like a mystery of like, well, what was going on? And then it sort of became this kind of Matrix thing of like, you've been caught in this loop. This happens all the time, and kind of ending up with this sort of architect at the end being like, oh, it's you again, and so like that was really cool. And because it where the story ends is a very different place from where it starts, I think, where you're worried about like, oh gosh, like she's got to find all these totems, to get everything together and kind of make the world right. And then you start going through it and you're like, oh, well, maybe I think it's her uncle, like, is not kind of who he claims to be and what's going on. And
wait, really quick. So just for listeners, if you have not read Danger and Other Unknown Risks, we will probably be talking about some spoiler type things. But anyways, continue.
Yeah, so it was one of those things where it just ended up in a very, very different place. And it was great to see, like, how the main character reacts to that and, like, goes forward with that, you know, because that could just be something that could make somebody just fall apart. You know, it's just like when you realize your whole world was been kind of this lie, then, like, what do you do with it? And so it was really great to see her take that on and kind of find herself and, you know, find a different path. It's not like it's either A or B. She's like, I'm going to go with option C and see what that gets me.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's really interesting about this book is Erica and Ryan kind of created it as simultaneously like a send up of the idea of the Chosen One story, like, you know, Neo, you know, for the Matrix, a send up of that, but also in the process kind of perfected it because they made it something that was slightly different and slightly, you know, a little bit more unique than your average story in the sense that the Chosen One realizes that basically the thing that makes them special is that they recognize that the only way they can do that is with other people. And that's kind of like where magic really comes from. Like I really love the sequence. There's a scene where they're on like the farm and they like find all the people who they realize that they can actually have electricity if they basically make spells together and that they join up and everything. And I think that stuff is super smart and also kind of making the villain a person who basically won't stop thinking about themselves, but also won't let go of the past and won't find new answers because they think that, you know, the world is broken and only I know what was best. And it was when we could watch Deuce Bigalow and Cannonball Run 2. Like those things I think are really, really great about it. And, you know, I really love this book. This is one of my favorites from the last couple of years. And it's such a charming book.
Yeah, it really is. And it's, you know, finding out like, you know, kind of the man behind the curtain, like what's in his workshop? What is he always working on? And then when you find that out, you're like, oh, okay. Well, that sure changes things.
This guy's kind of a moron.
Yeah. Well, and also the fact that, you know, it's kind of these two different ideas of, because that was one of my, I think, favorite parts in the book was when they were on the farm, because it really showed that, like, you know, the uncle is like trying to get back to this point where they were in the world. And, you know, his idea is just like, well, we just kind of have to keep going back and resetting things and, you know, make things right somehow. You know, we're caught in this loop. And on the farm, you realize, like, you know, people recover, people figure stuff out. You know, like, you can still have this devastating thing happen and recover from it and rebuild and find a way to make things work. You know, like where she finds out, oh, they all have electricity. How do they do that? Well, they share the sort of kickback of the magic, you know, and so it's like when that is shared among a number of people, there's not as much of a negative impact as far as just one person doing that and taking it on themselves. And so that just was a very touching thing to see and realize that, you know, this world isn't as bad as Uncle thinks it is.
Right. I also think it's funny that the whole thing is built off of Y2K. And so, like, in an interesting way, it's kind of like set in amber, set in stone, where it's just like, this is a moment in time, kind of like Runaways is in its own regard. And I think that stuff really works in it. It's such a fun book, and it's like so smartly done. And I also like the fact that the way that they set up the magic is it works differently in every kind of community, but also like the way that people use the magic works different. Like they think about the magic in different ways. And it really kind of underlines like the power of community and like the way that like how you kind of approach life really impacts how the magic of life works out for you, whether or not you can use spells or not. Yeah, I just love this book. I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of that thing of like, you know, words are magic. You know, like you can make things happen with that or not happen with it by changing ideas. You know, like the fact that she talked with the little farm boy and was realizing like, oh, you know, like what he's saying is like magic in the sense it opened up her mind to something different, you know, and it's just like within, you know, just, I mean, even, you know, cultures and, you know, different places, it's like language is so powerful, you know, and no matter what the kind of words are, or the sounds that you use to make these words, it's like they all have an impact of some sort, and they have different impacts with different cultures because inflections and things like that. It's like you can listen to someone speaking Chinese or something and you're like, wow, why are they so angry and yelling? It's like, well, they're not. That's just how it's spoken, and somewhere else it's just like, wow, they're being really nice. You're like, no, you're getting chewed out right now, and it's different, across the board. So it's just kind of like interesting to think of like words themselves almost being magic and then having different implications in different places.
Speaking of words being magic, what did you think of the talking dog, Daisy?
Oh, she was great. I think she was probably my favorite character besides the frog, but the frog has kind of like
Thank you.
little bit, has only like kind of a little bit of thing, but it's sort of like, okay, let's, throw this frog around and see what happens and see if it's okay. And I think he was like Mr. Toadsworth.
Mr. Toadsworth the third.
The third, yeah. And I mean, it's just like, what a great name, but kind of secretly a very important character to make sure that like it was okay to go into these different worlds and stuff. It's like, oh, he's okay. Let's keep going.
The funny thing is I feel like if Erica or Ryan end up listening to this, they'll be like, oh my God, this is obviously a very fitting couple, because when they came on the podcast, I was like, we need to talk about the toad. Mr. Toadsworth the third, which implies Mr. Toadsworth the second and the first, and then the book ends with Mr. Toadsworth the fourth. And I'm like, oh my God. I also love, so Erica is one of my favorite artists. And what she does in that one scene when she first throws it, where she actually shows it tumbling and everything like that, she's such a smart storyteller when it comes to art that it really underlines just like how art is storytelling, and like people really need to give it more credit. The other thing too is so they worked on Squirrel Girl together, Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, and on this one, Erica and Ryan co-wrote it. He had written Squirrel Girl and she was the artist, and so she co-wrote it and she was the artist, including colors. I don't know who lettered it. I want to say it was her. And so like in a lot of ways, like this is. Obviously, Ryan was a big part of it, but like this was Erica's like fingerprints were all over this book in a really cool way. And like to see this kind of come together was just like, oh, I loved it.
Yeah, this one was interesting compared to the Runaways one too, just in that the art was so different. Like it was a little bit more vibrant because I mean the paper is a little bit different. It was very like simple and clean, and just kind of had in the frame like what you needed to kind of get what was going on, and it was really nice. And what I thought was really cool too was that at the end of each chapter it would go into a flashback of some sort, but it was like, how do you say it? Like it's like the background would all drop out to where it would just be a white background with like just a couple characters or a little scene or something like that, and then go into a flashback of something she had remembered. And what was really interesting was that in the background of the panels in the flashback there's just sort of this, I don't know, like splash of color to kind of denote that you're doing something different here. But like even that transition going into that I thought was really interesting and just really beautiful, because it kind of, made everything come down to just like a couple characters or something like that. And then kind of flashback, so it was almost like everything else was sort of disappearing as you're going into this memory. And I thought that was really nice and really kind of cool the way it was done.
Erica is super smart about how she uses colors. I absolutely love it. But was there anything that didn't work for you?
What didn't work for me? I don't really think there was anything that didn't work for me on this. I think that there was enough going on, like how it was being told that, like I was okay with. Like I didn't really have
nothing
anything
was really a struggle, right?
Yeah, nothing was a struggle, like nothing I was confused about, or, again, like the book size was really nice. Like it was easy to, flip through and kind of sit and read through it. So it wasn't cumbersome in that way or anything. And the storytelling was really nice and easy to follow.
This is the only comic you read that was made as a single story in the format you read it in. Do you think it felt different because of that?
Not really. I mean, because it seems like there's still kind of chapters within this, and which I thought, one thing I thought was pretty cool was that when you'd go in, it was kind of this format of like, okay, the art background would kind of go to white, you go to flashback, and you go into the next chapter, and they would denote the new chapter within the art, which I thought was really pretty fun. And so, it's like reading a book. It's like, oh, next chapter, and I guess that's how I kind of saw it on Runaways also, is like it just felt kind of like, I know it was like maybe a different issue, or
it shows the cover art.
Yeah, it shows the cover art, so it's kind of like it's a good place to be like, okay, just pause as you move, sort of transition into this next one. So it didn't really feel that different in that sense.
Was there a favorite part in this one?
Let's see. I think my favorite part was, I really enjoyed the part on the farm because I felt like that was just a very inspiring, just a lot of beautiful things happening there. They're outside looking at the stars, talking about magic and how it can be shared and all of that. But I think I also kind of liked the part where they meet the mayor, just because it, like, at that point, everything kind of comes to a head where she's like, this is the last thing I need to get, and this is what I'm going to do. And that's where it kind of felt like that, architect thing.
That was
like,
definitely the architect.
This has been your life. Like, oh, I see you're a little more feisty than the other ones. And, like that kind of thing where she's like, wait, what? No, like, what's going on? And she's really trying to grapple with, like, should I trust this woman? She's starting to talk about things that maybe I feel like is right, but I don't want to accept it because that means saying everything I've known before has been a lie. And, it was just a very fun scene to have it all happen.
Was there anything particularly cool in how the story was told or in how it read, or confusing?
No, I think it was just really well done. It was nice and clean, and, everything just seemed to come together really beautifully, and there was nothing that stood out like that.
Last question in regards to danger and other unknown risks. This is the only non-superhero story you read. We discussed this already in the first part of the podcast, but do you feel like reading this surprised you at all about what comics can be about or how they can be told?
Honestly, no, because I just have the idea of, like, comics are just a way to tell stories, rather than comics are a certain thing. So it wasn't surprising in that sense. And to me, it was just kind of like a fantasy novella or something like that. Like it in, the art definitely helped kind of convey what was going on, but it didn't feel like, well, when's, I don't know, when's, Captain America going to jump in and do something, or when is this going to happen, or when are we going to find out the red skull's behind the whole thing? Or something like that. That
would have been a twist.
Yeah, it would have been a twist. Maybe that was the architect, but it didn't feel like it was different, good or bad or anything. It was just like, it was a story, and it's a visual story, and it's the fact that it's not a superhero one. I mean, it didn't even really play into my thought process of that.
Lastly, we have the DC release, your most recent read, which you read on the plane. I have a feeling you're going to have thoughts on the format of this because it's bigger and you read it in a plane seat, which is kind of a deadly combination. But it was Cliff Chiang's Catwoman Lonely City, the DC Black Label story about an older Catwoman digging into a mystery in a Gotham City of the future after she gets out of prison. You just read it on the flight back, as I said. What did you think?
Oh, I love this one. And yeah, the format is a little bit larger. And I mean, I think that's sort of, there's a plus and minus to that. Like, the plus is that it was probably the more dense artwork of the three that I read. And so it was just, there was a lot going on, like, in a great way. Like, it was very fleshed out and, like, beautiful. And there was just a lot of different panels and things going on, and how it read was really amazing. That if it was in a smaller format, I think you would have lost some of that. But then, yeah, on a slightly bigger format, it's just, I mean, anything that size is a little difficult to read. I mean, on a plane, not on a plane. I mean, on a plane's probably a little bit easier because I can kind of like kick my leg up or use the tray to kind of like, help balance stuff out. I've got the little light I can like move around to make sure it's hitting in the right spot and stuff like that. But yeah, the larger format in that sense, it's just a little bit more challenging. Like, it's not something I would read in bed, that's for sure, because it would just fall on me, I'm sure.
Notice I didn't give you an omnibus.
I know, and I appreciate that because I think, I mean, we went through a whole thing of that before of, how do you read them, so.
Yeah, that is one of the interesting things about comics, I think, and maybe this is the case for other mediums too, but the format impacts stuff so much, where it's like you had, 2 digest-sized books, basically. You had Danger and Other Unknown Risks, and you had Runaways. And then you have Catwoman Lonely City, which is an oversized hardcover. And in some ways, in terms of readability, the first 2 are probably slightly easier to read because they're digest-sized, and it's just so easy to put in your hand and read. But on the flip side, it's like, if you really consider it as a creative person, like Cliff is, having more space to tell the story really impacts the way you tell the story if you think about it. And like you can have like denser, panel layouts. You can do things you can't do in the smaller formats. And I think that's one of the really cool things about comics is like if you can make things the way that works for you and tell the story in a completely different way than you would in other formats. And that's a really cool thing about comics.
Yeah, and like all 3 of these books were done very differently, and I wouldn't say one's better than the other necessarily. They were just all different, and that was really nice. I guess, kudos for me for picking out such a variety too. From your slim pickings, I mean? Like you gave me choices and I went through and picked stuff out, but it was I mean, it's a good slice. Like they are not the same, like just at its core, like Cliff did all of this stuff here, and then on the danger one, like, I mean, there were just kind of 2 people being credited there. So it's like, it was there. I mean, these are just like very different just from the creation of them.
Yeah. Like with Runaways, where it's like, you have like, that's more of like the Marvel movie where you have like the sea of names. Obviously, it's still not that many people when you really think about it, but at the same time, versus 2 or 1, like it is with this one, it's dramatically different.
Yeah, I'm used to kind of seeing like author and editor,
yeah,
or
exactly.
something like that.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not used to seeing like a big list of names and stuff like that. So, that's just different from my perspective, but there is a lot more that goes into these than just writing, because you're creating the world for people. I mean, these are basically like storyboards, that whether or not they move on to something else. I mean, you're showing like, this is what's going to happen. This is what the world looks like. This is how Catwoman looks older. This is her face. It's not this, it's not that. It's, it really puts things squarely, like, this is what it's going to look like.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I will say is like there's some comics that kind of do read as storyboards, like where they're like, I would like this to be an adaptation. The thing that's really good about these books is like they're designed for the comic book medium and really maximize the comic book medium. And like, I know you don't mean anything detrimental by saying storyboards, but it's like they are so focused on just being the best comic they can be. And they really show that, I think.
Yeah.
Was there anything in specific that worked for you?
In specific, I think it was just the art of it was just really beautiful. Like, I just wanted to kind of stop and take it in and be like, well, what's that in the background? Like, what does that protest sign say? What's this cheetah outfit this lady's wearing? Or, like instead of like Supreme, it's like
Superman.
Super, comma man or something like that. Or, just things like that. Like there's a lot of very, like small things that help to like make it feel bigger.
That's okay. So again, we're totally aligned because when I talked to Cliff, I was just like, I love the super comma man thing. But there's some things in there. He does it in a way that's new readers can read this and understand what's going on. But there's other things where it's like, if you have like 10% more knowledge of this universe, you'll really get it. So like there's the shop where the woman who owns the super comma man thing, it's called OG Beast. There is a DC villain called KG Beast. And so calling it OG Beast is like a play on one of the most ridiculous villains in Batman's history. And so when I first saw that, I was like, oh my God, like, what are you doing here, Cliff? You're breaking me. This is too good. I love it. Yeah,
there is a lot of things like that, like Ivy's coffee thing, because at first I was like, this kind of looks like the, sort of Starbucks call out, call back of that, but also the Hawaiian Airlines. I don't know if you know what that looks like. There's the Hawaiian Airlines logo or formal logo used to have this woman with like the flower in her hair and stuff. And I was this kind of looks like a mix between the two of those. And then it's like, oh, okay, I see where this is going now. And, it made a lot of sense, but it kind of like triggered these little things for me that I was like, oh, this is super fun. So, as I was reading it, I felt more, I guess, involved in the world in that sense because it had me thinking and looking around more than I was in the other ones. So.
Well, one of the common things that's said about stories, not just comics, but like all types of stories, is the world you're in as a character too. And to some degree, that can be true for all stories. But like in this, like you were talking about the posters in the background and stuff like that. Earlier in the book, you can really get an idea as to what Gotham is like if you just look in the background. And you can get a really an understanding of, like, there's big things. There's like the police that have like the Batman ears coming up and stuff like that. But then there's other things about, you know, I don't know, varying things that they're watching out for now. And you can kind of get a sense as to like how big of a kind of pressure cooker Gotham is in that moment. And that's one of the things I think Cliff is really incredible about, is not just he uses backgrounds as like text in a really interesting way that if you don't see it, you won't necessarily miss out. But if you do see it, you actually get a richer read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. And like I guess they had to have like, I think they were called G bands or something, like kind of identifiers and stuff. And so every so often you would see, you know, one of these, I don't know, Bat police people that kind of goes into their helmet and what they're seeing because they're scanning for different stuff. You know? So it's like you kind of understand quickly, like, oh, okay, well, you know, these people have it or don't, or this, you know, you're understanding like what's happening there without there having to be language.
Mm-hmm. Earlier in the podcast, we talked about how weird it was for you as an outsider to see different versions of characters than the ones you know, at least to some degree, because, you know, you understand the fact that there's multiverses and universes and everything for these characters. But this story takes place in a future version of Gotham City that features characters that have evolved from what they typically are in the stories you've seen them in. Did that all make sense to you? Like, did Cliff make that add up?
Yeah, that all made sense to me. It was just basically, I think it was like 10 years later, she had gotten out of jail and the world was different, you know, but kind of the same but different, you know, and that made sense to me and I could follow along with that. And there were different characters that I was familiar enough with that it was like, oh, and then this person, of course, they'll kind of tie in this way or that way. And you know, it's like 10 years down the line and things have kind of changed for them, you know, and so that was kind of fun to see where they find themselves at, you know, and they're not kind of the young whippersnappers of, you know, of all that. It's sort of like they're older, they got knee problems, which I can relate to, you know.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, got to climb up this building. Well, I can't relate to that, but you know, it's just that thing of like, okay, I'm getting a little older. My body's not a 20-something anymore. Like, what do I do when I know I want to be able to do these things, but I'm not physically able? And just like how they work through that. And I feel like that helps make it very real and not even in a, I don't know, like, oh, it's funny that they're old, but you know, it's natural. It's what's going to happen. Like, you haven't been running around doing your acrobatics for like 10 years and now you're in like your 50s or something. I'm like, yeah, you're going to feel it.
Yeah.
You know, unless you're doing like yoga in jail, you know, I don't know how you keep up with that. So
in a lot of these stories, these characters are not allowed to progress because they want to maintain the vision of like Peter Parker, Spider-Man is always a down on his luck dude who swings through and saves people because with great power comes great responsibility. And that's just how he always is. He's always kind of like almost 30, basically. But in this one, you were able to see like Two-Face was reformed and become the mayor. And then like the Riddler becomes just like a regular dude and has like a daughter, like all this stuff like that. Ivy's doing her thing. One of my favorite character in the book is Killer Croc. And like he's normally like this just brainless like monster basically. But in this, he's like a dude in a bar who's kind of like waiting for something to change in his life. And like I just absolutely love that character. I thought that was so well done. And it's really interesting to see what Cliff can do when he's given the space because like this story isn't really kind of quote unquote in continuity. It's just doing its own thing and it can exist in its own right. That's one thing I think is interesting is I actually think even though you like Marvel stories better in movies, I think you like DC comics better because they have way more stories like this where you can read them in isolation that just tell great stories involving characters you know, and you understand it because you understand the characters and you understand their world and you understand that this is just a new story for them, just like a movie would be or like a TV show would be. And this is a great example of that because everything you need to know is on the page.
Yeah, and because it's told a little bit later where she's not in her prime, or the other characters aren't in their prime either, I don't think that makes it a lesser story. I think it kind of makes it a little bit more interesting because it's like, those questions of like, well, am I still doing the right thing? Like, should I still be doing this? What should I be doing? And I mean, I think that that's kind of relatable to people too. It's like, you're not going to perpetually be in your 20s and 30s forever, and that's okay. It's like, you can still have this like fulfilled life and stuff. And like, it doesn't have to be like always told from just these certain generations, of like, okay, well, here we go. Let's rehash this again, but maybe some things a little bit different. It's like, it's kind of nice to see, sort of like these washed up people, and it's sort of like, well, what are they doing with themselves now? Or have they just said, okay, I'm going to do something different, and this is what I do now?
Well, a perfect example of that is Barbara Gordon, who was Batgirl in her younger years. Like, she moved on to become a politician also, because I think she kind of realized that she can do more good as like somebody who's trying to really change the way that Gotham works, as opposed to like fighting criminals and stuff like that, which is always a question with like Batman. The question they always ask is like, why doesn't he spend his billions to like, make social programs and stuff like that? And the reality is like Cliff doing something like that with Barbara Gordon, I think, is a nice kind of look at like how else you can approach the world as you age, and like kind of what your priorities change. Because frankly, it's just sometimes punching and kicking people into your 50s probably would not be the best thing for your body.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was there anything that didn't work for you?
I think the only thing I'd say what maybe didn't work for me on this one was just some of the characters I wasn't familiar with. So there was the guy who has the demon living in him.
Yeah.
It's like I'm sure it was kind of like tickling the back of my brain. Like, I feel like I might know this guy from something, or have heard of him, or played him in the Lego game or something like that. But there was just some stuff like that where I don't want to say it's like a total negative, but it was just something where it was some characters I wasn't very familiar with, but it didn't really take away from the story. It was just sort of like, I'm not sure about this guy. Oh, he does this. Okay, he's doing this now. All right, here we go.
Why is he rhyming?
Yeah, so it wasn't enough to like really take me out of the story or anything, but there was some stuff where I was like, I'm going to go look this guy up, or, who's this person again? Like, I want to just familiarize myself with that. But like I said, it didn't like take me out of the story, but just on the negative, it was like one of those things of, like when we go watch movies, you're just like, oh my God, it's so-and-so. I'm like, I don't know who that is, and it's like these little nuggets for people that if you know, and it makes it that much more, fulfilled for you, like reading or watching it. And I think that was just something I kind of like missed out on some stuff, but yeah. Again, like, I don't think it was like enough that I'm like, oh, I didn't like it because I didn't know half the people. I think there was like maybe 2 or 3 people or something. I wouldn't be able to like that one guy just stands out. But like I said, there was enough going on in the story that it's sort of the context filled me in on what I needed to know for that time. So,
he's a dude who turns into a demon. Yeah.
And I'm like, and that's all I need to know. And this is happening. And here we go. It wasn't like, I don't understand. Like, what? I'm like, I could figure that out on my own somewhere else. Like, it wasn't something that was necessary for the story.
I just realized I don't think he actually rhymes in the story, which is kind of funny. That's like one of his whole things.
They do ask him why he's not rhyming.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I forgot that was the case. Also, I know Clarion the Witch Boy showed up, which is funny because that is like a deep cut. Well, not a deep cut, but it's like definitely not somebody that like people who don't normally read DC comics would be like, oh my God, Clarion the Witch Boy.
I think he said he's a witch man.
Oh, he's a witch man. Yeah, he's grown up.
He's grown up now. Okay, this is in the future.
Well, I mean, but I think that the thing is, it's kind of done in a different way than like the Marvel movies. Like when you watch Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, where it's like the Illuminati shows up, and if you know those characters, you're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And that's done kind of cheaply. This is at least done just for like plot, like where it helps you understand. But I mean, obviously that's something that was kind of confusing to some degree, but was there anything that was confusing in how the story was told or in how it read, or anything particularly cool about how it was handled?
I think just the colors in it were just really great. Like I love color and stuff, and these were like colors in my palette, like I loved it. I loved the way it looked, and, kind of having these almost like monochromatic type pages to make something really stand out, as far as like, this is what's going on, or see sort of something in shadow, like you see her in shadow with, everything else. It was just beautifully done. But this one, I think, was one of those that I was a little concerned at first, like just kind of flipping through it before I read it, of like, oh man, this is probably one I'm going to have a hard time following narratively, because there's just a lot going. It's dense. It's dense, but there's like kind of the way it's set up. It's just it was just more than what I was used to, and the way that the dialogue and stuff worked. I didn't have a problem with it at all. But initially, I was like, oh man, it is pretty dense, and like, how am I going to distinguish between who's actually talking, what's going on? Because sometimes there's bubbles, but it's not going to a character because they're off. They're not in the panel, and so it's like they're off panel.
Off panel. Sorry, I completely derailed you.
So they're off panel talking, and so you just see this talk bubble, and you're kind of like, oh, who's that? But there was enough going on that it was, once I was in it, it was very easy to follow, and it wasn't even something I was thinking of. So I thought that was really cool of, that apprehension of like, am I going to be able to actually follow and like read it in the correct way? I didn't have a problem with that at all.
I do want to say that I think you're actually the first person that's ever come on the podcast and said the name of the podcast on the podcast, which is funny because we always talk about, you said the name of the movie in the movie. Oh my God. So I feel like that's very fitting. But did you have a favorite part?
I did. I actually had a couple of them. Like one of them was when there's people protesting outside, and they're trying to say how they're in line with, Catwoman. They want to support her, and they all put on these cat masks.
Yeah.
And I thought that was super great because it, just showed how everyone was coming together and trying to like be like, we're trying to do the right thing here, and plus the cat masks were just like freaky, dark Cheshire cat mask, which was super fun. And it was just one of those moments where like everyone's coming together and it feels very like cohesive, and like this is how change happens, And the other one was the one with the it's just a small scene where there's one of those bat cop people talking to somebody, and they're like, oh, this seems like this fruit's rotten. And the guy's like, no, it's not rotten. It's a durian. That's how they smell. It's not rotten. And the guy's like, are you calling me a liar? And then he starts like looking him up, like he's going to try to arrest him for being a liar somehow. Like he's going to find something on him. And
it's going to up on court view.
Yeah. It's just like, oh no, his green card and everything's all in line, and it's just this funny little scene of like, what would probably happen in a city with someone that's not familiar with something like that. And also just anything involving durians, I just find hilarious because it is like, what in the world, like, why does that fruit exist? It is the weirdest fruit, and I understand, like, it's got its place in the world, but it's just like, whew, that is an acquired taste for sure.
Yeah.
At a very young age.
Also, you have personal history because you have a couple of friends / former one former coworker who went out to get durian shakes just as like a personal challenge food.
Yeah.
You did not, though.
I watched it happen and I declined because I was like, I can smell it from here, and I don't want that. It's flavor in
potent.
my mouth.
It's potent.
It's quite potent. So anyway, but I mean, that was just one of those things that like I was just laughing out loud because it was just this quirky little thing. But it kind of, again, like it's these little things that put you in that world, and it feels real, and it feels like a world like I've been in and stuff. So
I think that was the one time during one of these books that you were reading where you turned to me and you're like, this part. And I was like, oh, I think Amber likes this one. Yeah. Did you have a favorite character?
I gotta say, I think that I liked... I don't recall her name. It was the Asian woman that was running like the little sneaker shop.
Oh, yeah.
Because she just seemed like she was like the lady behind everything. Like you go to her to like...
She knows what's up.
She will put you in contact with who you need to be and stuff. And it was just really kind of funny to see that she's just like, I'm on top of everything here. Like, and I know it's like she didn't have like the biggest part in the book, but it's just like, she kind of calls to mind of like this bigger world and that there's more happening. And
well, I mean, that's the thing with world building is it's not always big. Sometimes it's just like you speak into existence a larger world by showing this shop who is run by like this total awesome person who like is in control of a lot more things than people realize. It's not just like a store that sells clothes and skateboard decks and stuff.
Yeah, and that's, she definitely, when they go, kind of through the back door, and you see kind of all these people working and stuff, and it definitely had that cue feel of like, okay, this is where the magic happens back here. Like, what is it you need? Like, we got these people, we got those people, and she just doesn't seem like someone you want to mess with.
Yeah,
like very much like an Asian mom.
Yeah,
like you do whatever she says. Like she knows what's up. You're gonna eat those weird smelling herbs because they're gonna help your knee out or whatever.
Did you find that she reminded you of your mom at all?
Yeah, and every other Asian mom I've ever encountered.
Yeah.
Just one last thing I wanted to say on the Catwoman one was that this one was interesting because at the end of it, there was a couple pages from the editor talking about some of the art and stuff and how Cliff had done it all. And they had these little vignettes of the process of, how he had put it all together. And I thought it was just really beautiful. And to like see that was really nice. And then also, I don't remember if it was before or after that, they did have like some cover variants. And so this was one of those that was a single issue that, this is a collection of those. And like, I gotta say, like seeing that versus seeing that in the Jane Foster one was like night and day, because it was like, oh, this is like the cover from this one or a variant of this one, an issue and stuff like that.
It helped you understand.
It helped me understand, and it was all relevant to these stories and these comics, and it was just beautiful to see all the different art, and I thought that was really great.
So we went over the variant books. You had the experience of reading some comics that you picked based off of some selects I made in advance. Did you enjoy the experience overall? I did like it. I thought it was great, and like there would, maybe I'd be open to some more suggestions from you. I was going to say, I mean, the $1 million, I mentioned $1 million question earlier. If there's $1 million question, then this is the $1 billion question. Could you see yourself reading more comics in the future? Yeah, I could see that. Well, I'm really glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad you took this on. And I hope people enjoyed the experience of getting perspective from somebody that doesn't read comics. Obviously, it was like a cherry-picked one, but it's kind of like, if somebody recommends you a TV show and they're like, I think you would like this based off of something, based off of other things you like. I mean, it's the same thing. It's a medium that anything is possible. But Amber, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk about a bunch of comics, your experience as a non-comics reader, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. I'm going to leave in the full break just for maximum awkwardness. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with non-comics reader and my wife, Amber Harper. You can find her work on Sketch from time to time. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman for stepping in to edit this one. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic or following me at @SliceRightGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Faith Aaron Hicks, Yeah Comics, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Danny Ollie, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Alan Ellsworth, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polgees, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian Hull, Chris Dorey, Near Levy, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Petra Coyle, Isaac Orens, Capes and Tights Podcast, Claus Van de Ven, Submit Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Bauer, Declan Shelby, Dan Gurino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Liana Kingus, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Stephen Hall, Philip Myra, Chris Bachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Walt's Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Gibb, Sean Kirkham, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwand, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Assey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abbott, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.